Before starting the story, subscribe our channel for more stories. Let's start our story. The rain in Oakhaven didn't fall. It drifted, a gray, suffocating mist that smelled of wet slate and industrial runoff. Arthur Vance sat in his 2014 sedan, the engine idling with a rhythmic rattle that felt like a death cough. He wasn't looking at the rain. He was looking at the monolithic gates of Blackwood Industries, the steel and glass fortress that had swallowed his son's life 6 months ago. Arthur wasn't a man of violence. He was a man of blueprints, torque converters, and Sunday morning pancakes. He was a father whose world had been reduced to a single 8x10 photograph on the mantel and a burning, icy core of grief where his heart used to be. 6 months ago, Leo Vance, 24, bright-eyed and an aspiring engineer, had taken a night shift at Blackwood's experimental turbine plant. There was an unforeseen pressure fluctuation. That was the official term used by the corporate lawyers. Arthur knew the truth. He'd seen the leaked maintenance logs before they were scrubbed. The safety valves hadn't been inspected in years. The fluctuation was a predictable explosion caused by a series of cost-cutting measures that favored dividends over human lives. Arthur remembered the day the corporate liaison visited his home. The man had worn a suit that cost more than Arthur's car and offered a settlement package with a non-disclosure agreement attached to it like a parasite. Arthur hadn't taken the money. Instead, he had taken a leave of absence from his own job at the municipal water works and converted his garage into a war room. He began by mapping the invisible. Every morning he'd sit in his car, recording the shift changes at the Blackwood facility. He observed the cadence of the security patrols, the timing of the automated gate sensors, and the specific route taken by the CEO, Silas Vane. Arthur knew he couldn't take these men down with a frontal assault. They had private security, armored SUVs, and the law in their pockets. He had to be the ghost in the machine. He had to make their world collapse with the same mechanical inevitability that had killed Leo. The first target was Julian Reed, the lead engineer who had signed off on the faulty safety reports. Arthur didn't want him dead. He wanted him ruined. Reed was a man of high-end tastes and low-end morals, living in a glass-walled penthouse that overlooked the city he helped pollute. Arthur spent weeks learning Reed's digital footprint. He didn't plant a virus. He planted a doubt. Using his own knowledge of fluid dynamics, Arthur created a simulated dataset that proved Reed's current project, a multi-million-dollar dam contract, was structurally unsound. He leaked this audit to the board of directors, disguised as an internal whistleblower report. Arthur watched from across the street as Reed was escorted out of the building by security. The man looked small, his expensive jacket rumpled as he was shoved toward the sidewalk. It was a cold comfort, but it was the first time Arthur had felt a spark of something other than despair. But Reed was just a cog. The real engine of the tragedy was Marcus Thorne, the head of security who had orchestrated the cover-up and intimidated the surviving witnesses. Thorne was a different animal, a former military contractor who understood violence. Arthur knew that to get to Thorne, he would have to step out of the shadows. Arthur began by sabotaging Thorne's personal life. He didn't use a knife, he used a wrench. He spent nights in the crawl spaces of the exclusive club Thorne frequented, tampering with the ventilation and the security feeds. He made Thorne look incompetent. Every time a glitch happened on Thorne's watch, Silas Vane's trust in his right-hand man began to erode. The pressure began to build. Arthur could feel it in the air, a tension like a coiled spring. He started leaving small tokens for Thorne to find. A singed piece of Leo's uniform, a copy of the maintenance log that was supposed to be destroyed. He was haunting Thorne, turning the man's own paranoia against him. Thorne began to lash out, firing loyal guards and becoming erratic. One evening, Arthur followed Thorne to a secluded bar on the outskirts of town. He didn't hide. He sat 3 stools away and ordered a coffee. Thorne looked aged, his eyes bloodshot. He turned to Arthur, sensing a presence he couldn't quite place. Arthur simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the storm that was coming. "You're the father," Thorne rasped, his voice like grinding stones. "The one who won't take the check." Arthur didn't blink. "The check doesn't bring him back, Marcus. It only pays for the silence. And I've found that I have a lot to say." Thorne reached for his waistband, but Arthur didn't flinch. He knew Thorne wouldn't do it here, not with the cameras he'd secretly re-enabled and linked to a cloud server. "You're playing a dangerous game, old man," Thorne hissed. "I'm not playing," Arthur replied softly. "I'm engineering a failure." That night, Arthur returned to his garage. The walls were covered in schematics of the Blackwood main server room. To truly destroy Silas Vane, he had to get to the Black Ledger, the encrypted files that held the records of every bribe, every safety violation, and every illegal backroom deal the company had ever made. Arthur had spent months building a specialized hardware bypass. He called it the Equalizer. It was a compact device designed to jump the gap in the facility's air-gapped network, but to plant it, he would need to enter the heart of the beast. He would need to enter the foundry. As the rain continued to wash over Oakhaven, Arthur Vance sharpened a different kind of tool. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a precision instrument of retribution. He looked at the photo of Leo one last time before switching off the lights. The reckoning was no longer a plan. It was an approaching reality. The infiltration began at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday. The guard rotation was at its slowest, and the heavy cloud cover provided the perfect shroud. Arthur moved with the practiced silence of a man who had spent 30 years working in the quiet corners of municipal infrastructure. He knew where the pipes ran, where the vents exhaled, and where the shadows were deepest. He slipped through a service hatch he had loosened weeks prior. Inside, the foundry was a cathedral of iron and heat. Even at night, the massive furnaces hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled Arthur's teeth. He avoided the main walkways, sticking to the catwalks that clung to the ceiling like spiderwebs. Below him, the automated floor sweepers moved in their mindless, pre-programmed patterns. He reached the server room's exterior wall. It was reinforced steel, cooled by a dedicated liquid nitrogen line. Arthur didn't try to hack the door. Instead, he targeted the cooling system. He applied a small, thermite-based charge to the intake valve, the same type of valve that had failed on Leo's shift. The reaction was silent and blindingly hot. The valve fused shut, and within minutes, the server room's internal temperature began to climb. The automated fire suppression system, gas-based and lethal to humans, was triggered. This was exactly what Arthur wanted. The system's emergency protocol required a physical override from the security hub, which would force Thorne to open the doors. Arthur waited in the vents, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard the heavy clatter of boots. Thorne and 2 guards arrived, masks donned against the halon gas. As they keyed the override, the heavy vault doors slid open. Arthur didn't wait for them to leave. He dropped from the vent with a heavy pipe wrench in hand. He wasn't a fighter, but he had the leverage of a man with nothing left to lose. He struck the first guard before they could turn. The second guard reached for his holster, but Arthur slammed the heavy door control, catching the man's arm in the closing mechanism. Now it was just Arthur and Thorne. Thorne pulled a combat knife, his eyes wide with a mixture of rage and realization. You think this changes anything? The data is encrypted. You'll never see it. I don't need to see it, Arthur said, his voice steady. I just need to move it. He lunged forward, not at Thorne, but at the main terminal. He jammed the equalizer into the maintenance port. The device lit up, blue LEDs pulsing as it began the high-speed transfer to Arthur's remote server. Thorne tackled him, and the 2 men crashed into the server racks. Pain flared in Arthur's shoulder as Thorne's knife found a mark, but Arthur didn't let go of the terminal. He used his legs to push off the rack, sending both of them sprawling across the floor. Thorne was younger and stronger, but Arthur was fueled by a decade of repressed anger. He grabbed a heavy metal canister of coolant and swung it with everything he had. The blow caught Thorne on the temple, and the big man went down hard. Arthur scrambled back to the terminal. The progress bar on the equalizer hit 100%. He didn't kill Thorne. He didn't have to. He pulled the device, slipped back into the vents, and vanished into the night just as the sirens began to wail across the complex. The next morning, the Black Ledger wasn't sent to the police. It wasn't sent to the newspapers. It was sent to the families of every worker who had ever been decommissioned by Blackwood Industries. It was sent to the insurance companies who had been defrauded. It was sent to the federal regulators who had been bribed. By noon, Blackwood Industries stock had plummeted to nearly zero. By evening, the FBI was raiding Silas Vane's estate. Arthur Vance stood on the cliffside overlooking the city, the rain finally stopping. He took the small 8x10 photo of Leo out of his pocket and looked at it. The burning in his chest hadn't gone away, but it was no longer cold. I finished the job, Leo, he whispered. He took his phone, the one containing the only copies of the data, and tossed it into the dark waters below. He walked back to his car, the engine starting with that same old rattle, and drove away from Oakhaven for the last time. The road out of Oakhaven was a long, winding ribbon of asphalt that bled into the interstate, and for the first 100 miles, Arthur didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't need to. He could feel the ghost of the city behind him, the smoke from the crumbling Blackwood Empire rising like a signal fire. He was a ghost now, driving a car that officially belonged to a man who had died in a paper trail 3 months ago. He had practiced this. He had scrubbed his life with the same precision he used to calibrate a water pressure sensor. He ended up in a town called Miller's Creek, a place so small it didn't even have a stoplight, just a blinking yellow eye that cautioned travelers to keep moving. He rented a cabin on the edge of the woods, paying 6 months in cash to a landlord who didn't care about names as long as the bills were crisp. The cabin smelled of cedar and old wood smoke, a stark contrast to the metallic, sterile scent of the foundry. For the first week, Arthur did nothing but sleep and breathe, but the peace was an illusion. A man like Silas Vane doesn't just go to prison and disappear. A billion-dollar empire doesn't vanish without leaving jagged shards behind. And those shards were looking for the hand that had shattered the glass. Arthur sat on his porch, cleaning a rifle he'd bought at a local trade show. He wasn't a hunter, but he knew that Marcus Thorne wouldn't have been stopped by a coolant canister to the head for long. Thorne was a professional, and professionals don't let a grudge go cold. Arthur began to set up a new perimeter. He didn't have the high-tech sensors of Blackwood, but he had the woods. He used fishing line, old bells, and the natural topography of the land. He turned the forest into an early warning system. 3 weeks into his stay, the first sign appeared. A black sedan too clean for the dirt roads of Miller's Creek passed by the general store while Arthur was loading supplies. It didn't stop, it didn't linger, but the driver's eyes had scanned the storefront with a mechanical efficiency that Arthur recognized. It was the hunt beginning. Arthur knew he couldn't stay in the cabin forever. If he stayed, he was a sitting duck. He needed to go back on the offensive. He spent the night looking at the small encrypted drive he'd kept, the one piece of the black ledger he hadn't leaked. It contained the private offshore accounts of the board members, the exit strategy, funds they thought were safe from the federal freeze. It was the oxygen they needed to breathe, and Arthur was going to cut the line. He drove to a library 2 towns over, using a public terminal and a series of VPNs he'd built into a portable deck. He began to bleed them. He didn't take the money for himself. He didn't want a cent of their blood-soaked profit. He began transferring the funds in small, untraceable increments to local charities, food banks, and low-income housing projects in the very neighborhoods Blackwood had exploited. Every transaction was a heartbeat of Leo's life being honored. Every dollar moved was a brick pulled from the foundation of Silas Vane's legal defense fund. Back at the cabin, the bells rang. It was 2:14 a.m. The sound was faint, a tiny silver chime from the north side of the creek. Arthur didn't turn on the lights. He grabbed the rifle and slipped out the back door, merging with the shadows of the pines. He knew this land better than they did now. He had spent his days walking every inch of it. He saw them moving through the trees, 3 figures in tactical gear. They weren't cops. They moved with the aggressive posture of mercenaries. Thorne had sent his best. Arthur didn't fire. He waited. He had rigged the old footbridge over the creek. It wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to isolate. As the lead man stepped onto the wood, Arthur pulled a disguised pin. The centerboard gave way, not dropping the man into the water, but snapping a heavy spring-loaded loop around his ankle, dragging him sideways into a thicket of thorns and pinning him. The other 2 scattered, suppressed fire spitting into the dark. Arthur was already gone, moving through a drainage pipe he'd cleared out. He came up behind the second man, using the heavy stock of the rifle to drop him with a single, calculated blow to the base of the skull. The third man was Marcus Thorne. "I know you're out here, Vance," Thorne shouted, his voice echoing through the trees. "You think this is justice. You're just a murderer in training. You're no better than us." Arthur stepped out from behind a massive oak, the rifle leveled at Thorne's chest. The moonlight caught the silver in Arthur's hair and the cold, steady light in his eyes. "I'm not a murderer, Marcus," Arthur said. "I'm a father who stayed up late to make sure the world was safe for his son, and when the world failed him, I decided to fix the world." Thorne raised his weapon, but Arthur was faster. He didn't shoot Thorne. He shot the pressurized canister of Bear deterrent he'd lashed to a tree directly above Thorne's head. The cloud of caustic chemicals exploded downward, blinding and choking the mercenary. Arthur walked up to the convulsing man and took his radio. He keyed the mic. "Silas, I know you're listening on the other end of this. You sent your dogs to my home. Now I'm coming to yours, not for your life, for your legacy. I'm going to make sure the name Blackwood is synonymous with garbage for the next 100 years." He left them there, tied and neutralized for the local sheriff to find in the morning, along with a packet of evidence that linked them directly to the illegal activities of the Vane family. Arthur returned to his car. He had one more stop to make. The final architect of the cover-up wasn't a gunman or an engineer. It was the lawyer, Elena Thorne, Marcus's sister, who had shredded the evidence. She was currently hiding out in a coastal villa, thinking her distance bought her safety. The drive was 14 hours. Arthur didn't drink coffee. The adrenaline of his purpose was enough. He arrived at the coast as the sun was beginning to bleach the horizon. The villa was a palace of white stone and glass, perched on a cliff like a vulture. He didn't break in. He walked to the front gate and rang the bell. When Alina appeared on the monitor, her face pale, Arthur held up a single folder. It was the original maintenance log from the night of the explosion, the one she thought she had burned. He had found the backup in a hidden partition of the server he'd hacked. "You have 10 minutes to call the prosecutor and confess," Arthur said into the intercom. If you don't, this goes to the one person you fear more than me. The families of the people you lied to, and they won't be as patient as I am." He sat on the curb and waited. He watched the waves crash against the rocks. He thought about Leo's graduation, the way the boy had looked in his cap and gown, full of hope and a desire to build things that lasted. 9 minutes and 50 seconds later, the police sirens began to wail in the distance. Arthur stood up, brushed the dust off his trousers, and started walking. He didn't go back to his car. He didn't go back to Miller's Creek. He just walked along the coastline, the weight that had been crushing his chest for 6 months finally beginning to lift. He had dismantled a titan. He had out-engineered the engineers of corruption. He was Arthur Vance, a father, and he was finally going home, not to a house, but to a memory he could finally live with. The global fallout was a slow-motion demolition. As the Black Ledger circulated through the veins of international finance, the name Blackwood didn't just fail, it became toxic. Across 3 continents, subsidiary companies shuttered overnight. In Germany, a turbine plant was seized by the state. In Brazil, a mining operation was halted by a massive workers' strike, fueled by the revelations of their own safety risks. Arthur Vance, moving between cheap motels and forgotten bus stations, watched it all on flickering television screens. He was no longer a man, he was a catalyst, but Silas Vane was not a man who accepted defeat. Stripped of his titles and his fortune, he had one thing left, a deep, dark network of debts owed by men who lived in the shadows. From a secure facility while awaiting trial, Vane moved his final pieces. He didn't want the data back, it was too late for that. He wanted Arthur's head. He hired a cleaner known only as the Architect, a man who specialized in making disappearances look like tragic accidents. The hunt shifted from the woods of Miller's Creek to the urban sprawl of Chicago. Arthur knew the Architect was close when his secondary secure emails began to bounce. The digital walls were closing in. Arthur realized he couldn't keep running. To end the cycle, he had to provide a final, definitive ending. He lured the Architect to an abandoned municipal pumping station, a maze of rusted iron and echoing chambers that Arthur knew better than his own name. The confrontation was not a cinematic duel. It was a cold, mechanical trap. Arthur used the station's ancient SCADA systems to manipulate the environment. He used steam releases to mask his movement and pressure-locked doors to herd the Architect like cattle. When they finally stood face-to-face in the central dry well, the Architect found himself standing on a platform rigged with a simple, elegant weight sensor. "You're good, Vance," the Architect whispered, a silenced pistol aimed at Arthur's heart. "But you're out of tricks." "I'm not out of tricks," Arthur replied, holding a remote detonator. "I'm out of patience. This station is built over a fault in the city's old water main. If I press this, the vacuum collapse will pull this entire chamber 50 feet underground. We both go. But I've already sent the location of Silas Vane's private stash, the one he's using to pay you, to the FBI. By the time you kill me, you're working for free." The Architect hesitated. In that second of greed-induced doubt, Arthur didn't blow the station. He activated the emergency fire suppression foam, burying the assassin in a mountain of suffocating, blinding chemicals. Arthur slipped away through a maintenance tunnel he had pre-cleared, leaving the Architect for the authorities. Arthur's final act was the most difficult. He traveled to the cemetery where Leo was buried. He didn't go to the grave, he knew Vane's men would be watching it. Instead, he sat in a car a mile away, looking at the site through binoculars. He saw the flowers people had left, strangers who had been moved by the story of the father who fought back. He saw the justice he had built. He made one last phone call to the lead prosecutor. "Check the vent in locker 412 at the Oakhaven Transit Hub," Arthur said. "You'll find the physical copies of the signed orders Silas Vane gave to bypass the safety protocols. It's the smoking gun for a first-degree murder charge." "Where are you, Arthur?" the prosecutor asked. "We can protect you. We can give you a new life." "I already have a new life," Arthur said softly. "I'm the man who fixed the machine." He hung up and destroyed the phone. Arthur Vance disappeared that day. Some say he moved to a small island in the Pacific. Others say he's still in the Midwest, working as a quiet handyman who can fix anything but a broken heart. But every time a corporate whistle is blown, or a corrupt CEO finds their private sins headlined on the morning news, the people of Oakhaven think of Arthur. The story of Blackwood Industries ended in a courtroom, with Silas Vane being led away in chains, his legacy a pile of ash. But the story of Arthur Vance never truly ended. It became a legend whispered in the breakrooms of factories and the cubicles of engineers. A reminder that while power can be bought and safety can be sold, a father's love is a force of nature that no machine can ever hope to contain. Arthur had finally found peace, not in the absence of his son, but in the knowledge that no other father would have to stand at a gate and wonder why the world had let their child go. The blueprints were finished. The project was complete. Arthur Vance walked into the sunset of his own making, a shadow among shadows, finally truly free. Arthur Vance did not stay in the shadows of the Midwest. He realized that a man with his specific set of skills, the ability to see the skeletal structure of a corporation and know exactly which bolt to remove to make the whole thing scream, was a man who could never truly retire. He moved to the Pacific Northwest, settling in a town where the trees were so thick they felt like a green fortress. He took the name Elias Thorne, a subtle irony only he would appreciate, and opened a small shop specializing in the restoration of antique clocks. He liked clocks, they were honest. If they stopped, it was because a gear was worn or a spring had snapped. There was no corporate greed in a pendulum, no hidden agenda in a mainspring. But as he sat in the back of his shop, surrounded by the rhythmic ticking of 100 mechanical hearts, the world outside continued to churn with the same filth he had fought in Oak Haven. It started with a knock on his door at 2 in the morning. It wasn't an assassin. It was a woman, barely 20, her eyes wide with the same haunting terror Arthur had seen in his own mirror for years. She held a thumb drive like it was a live grenade. Her name was Sarah, and she worked for a pharmaceutical giant that was intentionally suppressed the data on a life-saving drug to keep their current, less effective patent profitable. "I heard about you," she whispered. "In the forums, they call you the watchmaker." Arthur looked at the drive. He thought about the peace he had found, the quiet life, the lack of blood on his hands. Then he thought of Leo. He thought of all the sons and daughters who would never come home because a board of directors decided their lives were an acceptable margin of error. "Come in," Arthur said, the old fire beginning to stir in his gut. He didn't just help her leak the data, he taught her how to dismantle them. Over the next year, Arthur Vance became the silent architect of a dozen corporate collapses. He operated through a decentralized network of whistleblowers, providing them with the technical blueprints and the tactical maneuvers to strike where it hurt most, the infrastructure. He stayed one step ahead of the private intelligence firms and the alphabet agencies. He lived out of a go bag, moving every 3 months, leaving behind nothing but a perfectly repaired clock on the mantle of every house he inhabited. He became a ghost story told in boardrooms, the man who could turn your own HVAC system into a recording device, the man who could make your stock price vanish with a single, well-placed line of code. But the final confrontation wasn't with a company, it was with his own past. Silas Vane, dying of cancer in a high-security prison, sent a final message. He didn't want forgiveness. He wanted Arthur to know that he had won. He revealed that Blackwood Industries had been a subsidiary of a much larger entity, a global conglomerate called Apex Titan. "You cut off a finger, Arthur," the message read. "But the hand is still reaching for you." Arthur knew what he had to do. He couldn't keep cutting off fingers. He had to go for the heart. He spent his final resources to disappear entirely, scrubbing Elias Thorne from existence. He traveled to the headquarters of Apex Titan, not with a bomb or a virus, but with the truth. He had spent years collecting the black ledgers of 100 different companies, and he realized they all connected. It was a single, vast web of corruption that held the global economy in a stranglehold. He didn't leak it to the press. He didn't send it to the government. He uploaded the entirety of the Omniledger to every single screen in the Apex Titan headquarters during their annual shareholder meeting. He didn't just show them the crimes, he showed them the faces of the people they had stepped on. He showed them Leo. As the building descended into chaos and the sirens of 1,000 police cars converged on the glass tower, Arthur stood on the roof, looking out over the city. He wasn't running anymore. He had created a system that was self-sustaining, a network of guardians who would keep watch long after he was gone. He felt a hand on his shoulder. It wasn't a threat. It was Sarah, the girl from the clock shop, now a leader in her own right. "It's over, Arthur," she said. "The machine is broken." "No," Arthur replied, a small, tired smile touching his lips. "The machine is finally calibrated. It's working the way it was supposed to." Arthur Vance walked away from the edge of the roof. He didn't look back at the burning legacy of his enemies. He looked forward to a world where a father could look his son in the eye and know that the world was built on something more than just greed. He had spent 10,000 hours in the dark, 10,000 hours in the cold, and 10,000 hours in the hunt. He had earned his silence. The watchmaker closed his eyes, listened to the rhythmic ticking of the world he had helped reset, and finally, for the first time in a lifetime, he let the clock run down. He was Arthur Vance, he was a father, and he was finished. The story of Arthur Vance was never truly about the end of a single man's life, it was about the birth of a shadow. While the world believed the watchmaker had finally allowed his own internal gears to stop, the reality was far more complex. Arthur had learned that in the machinery of the modern world, a single stationary point is easy to destroy. To survive and to truly protect the legacy of his son, he had to become a movement. For 2 years after the collapse of Apex Titan, the world felt a strange, pressurized silence. The massive corporate entities that had once operated with impunity began to self-correct, driven not by a sudden onset of morality, but by a cold, visceral fear. They knew that somewhere in a basement, a garage, or a high-rise apartment, someone was watching. They called it the Vance effect. Arthur himself had relocated to the rugged coast of Scotland, living in a stone cottage where the Atlantic spray acted as a natural barrier to the world he had dismantled. He went by the name Robert MacAllan. He spent his days repairing the rusted machinery of local fishermen and his nights monitoring the encrypted Vance network, the decentralized web of whistleblowers he had fostered. But a ghost can never truly rest when the living still have business with him. The final threat didn't come from a boardroom or a mercenary. It came from a young man named Julian Reed Jr., the son of the engineer Arthur had ruined in the very beginning. The boy hadn't inherited his father's cowardice. He had inherited his father's brilliance and a bottomless well of inherited spite. He had spent years tracing the digital breadcrumbs Arthur had left behind, not to rebuild the empire, but to kill the man who had turned his father into a broken alcoholic. Julian Jr. didn't send a team, he sent a signal. He hacked into the Vance network not to shut it down, but to redirect it. He began feeding the whistleblowers false data, leading them to target innocent companies and altruistic organizations. He was turning Arthur's weapon of justice into a tool of chaos, tarnishing the name Vance and making the world long for the stability of the old, corrupt titans. Arthur watched from his cottage as the network he built began to eat itself. He saw the headlines, the watchmaker's legacy, from justice to terrorism. He knew he was being baited. He knew that Julian was waiting for him to log in from a primary terminal to show a flicker of digital presence that could be traced to a physical coordinate. Arthur sat at his workbench, a small brass gear held between his tweezers. He had a choice. He could stay in Scotland, let the network die, and keep his life, or he could engage one last time and lose everything he had spent years hiding. He thought of Leo. Leo wouldn't have cared about the survival of a name, but he would have cared about the truth. Arthur didn't go to a computer. He went to his cellar. Underneath a pile of old lobster traps sat a vintage shortwave radio, the kind of analog technology that modern algorithms struggle to intercept. He spent 3 days broadcasting a series of numbers, not code, but coordinates and dates. They were the locations of every safety violation Leo had ever recorded in his private journals, the ones Arthur had memorized. He wasn't talking to the network. He was talking to the old guard, the retired engineers, the veteran inspectors, and the men who still remembered what it meant to build something with pride. The analog uprising, as the media later called it, bypassed Julian's digital traps entirely. 1,000 retired professionals walked into their old offices and handed over physical papers, blueprints, and ledgers. They swamped the system with so much physical truth that the digital lies Julian had planted were rendered irrelevant. Julian Jr. was found by the authorities in a high-end hotel in London, his servers bypassed by a group of veteran electrical engineers who had simply cut the power to the entire block and walked in with the police. With the threat neutralized, Arthur Vance knew the loop was finally closed. He had proven that justice didn't belong to a single man or a single network. It belonged to anyone willing to stand up and speak. In the autumn of 2028, a hiker in the Scottish Highlands found a small stone cairn overlooking the ocean. Tucked into the rocks was a pair of old engineer's calipers and a single, weathered photograph of a young man laughing in front of a university library. There was no body, no note, and no sign of a struggle. Arthur Vance simply stopped being Arthur Vance. In the years that followed, the world changed. Industrial safety became a matter of public record. Corporate transparency became the law of the land, and in Oakhaven, on the site where the Blackwood Foundry once stood, they built a park. In the center of the park is a large, functional clock made of salvaged industrial steel. It never loses a second. The people say that if you listen closely to the ticking of that clock, you can hear the heartbeat of a father who refused to let his son be forgotten. They say that as long as that clock keeps time, the machine will never be allowed to break again. Arthur Vance was gone, but the world he had engineered was finally running true. The story didn't end with a death, it ended with a balance. The gears were aligned, the friction was gone, and for the first time in 10,000 words there was nothing left to fix. The end. Don't forget to subscribe our channel. Goodbye till the next story.